There's a blue bench sitting between our two houses. For 3 years, I sat there alone every evening after work. Then one day, a woman moved in next door, setting the last moving box down on her porch. At that exact moment, a stranger walked past, smiling, and asked us, "Are you two a couple?" I laughed before I could think, the words slipping out on their own. "Yeah, she's my girlfriend." The woman turned to look at me. She didn't correct him. She just smiled very softly. And once the stranger walked away, she said quietly, "I don't want the kind part to be pretend." Nathan Carter is 35 years old, a bridge and road engineer who recently moved back to his hometown after years of working out on distant job sites, chasing contracts from state to state. He's the kind of man who can fix almost anything with his hands, a leaking faucet, a broken gate hinge, a stubborn car engine. But somehow, opening up to another person has always felt far harder for him than any repair job ever has. After his mother passed away 2 years ago, he quietly withdrew from nearly everyone on the street he grew up on, nodding politely to neighbors in passing but rarely stopping for more than that. Ava Collins is 32, a landscape designer who recently bought her late grandmother's old house on the same street, moving in with a plan already forming in her mind. She wants, more than almost anything, to bring the neighborhood back to what she remembers from childhood. A place where kids ran freely between yards and neighbors actually knew each other's names, not just their car models parked out front. The street itself has only 14 houses, once tightly knit, full of shared dinners and porch conversations that stretched late into warm evenings. Back when everyone left their doors unlocked and kids drifted from yard to yard without anyone thinking twice about it. But lately, things have quietly fallen apart, piece by piece, in the kind of slow erosion nobody quite notices until it's already happened. The older residents mostly keep to themselves now, isolated in houses too big and too quiet for just one person, curtains drawn earlier each evening. Younger families have moved away one by one, chasing bigger yards or better schools elsewhere, taking with them the noise and chaos that used to fill the block on weekend afternoons. The small park at the end of the block sits neglected, its swings rusted solid, its grass overgrown past the ankles. Worst of all, the community center that used to host everything from birthday parties to holiday potlucks is on the verge of shutting down completely, unable to cover its own basic operating costs any longer. A closure notice already taped quietly to its front door. Then, almost overnight, the town announces a contest called the Most Welcoming Street, offering a substantial grant to whichever neighborhood proves itself the friendliest, most connected community in the entire town. The prize money, everyone quickly realizes, checking the numbers twice at an emergency neighborhood meeting, would be more than enough to save the community center outright, keeping its doors open for years to come, maybe even funding new programs beyond what it ever offered before. That same week, everything shifts unexpectedly for Nathan and Ava. While Ava is unloading the final box from her moving truck, arms full, hair pulled back messily from hours of lifting, and Nathan happens to be walking past on his way home from work, still in his work boots, a stranger stops to chat, someone neither of them recognizes at the time, someone who seems friendly enough on a quiet residential sidewalk. Making pleasant small talk, the stranger asks casually whether the two of them are a couple. Without thinking much of it, assuming it's a harmless, throwaway comment from someone he'll never see again, Nathan simply laughs and says, "Sure." It feels, in that moment, like the smallest, most inconsequential thing in the world, barely worth a second thought as the stranger smiles and continues on down the sidewalk. It isn't inconsequential at all, as it turns out. That stranger, they later discover through a flyer posted at the community center a few days later, was actually part of the contest's official scoring committee, sent to quietly observe the neighborhood's genuine warmth and connection without anyone knowing they were being evaluated at all. Nathan's careless, offhand joke has just, entirely by accident, become part of the official record, noted down somewhere in a clipboard neither of them will ever actually see. Ava doesn't get angry about it, not really, though she'd have every right to, having just met this man 20 minutes earlier while still covered in dust from her own moving boxes. Instead, she simply turns to Nathan with a calm, steady look and says, "If you already said that, then the least we can do is stop acting like complete strangers to each other." Nathan hesitates, caught off guard by how reasonable, how measured her request actually sounds given the circumstances, before finally agreeing, extending a hand to help her lift the last box up onto the porch. By the end of that conversation, standing awkwardly on her half-unpacked porch as evening settles over the street, the two of them have quietly agreed to something neither of them fully understands the weight of yet. They'll play the part, at least in front of neighbors and any future evaluators, of being a couple for the sake of the street, for the sake of the community center hanging by a thread down at the corner. Playing the part, it quickly turns out, has almost nothing to do with romance at all, at least not in any obvious sense. There's no hand-holding for show, no staged kisses on the porch for passing evaluators to notice. Instead, it means something much more ordinary, much more demanding in its own quiet way. It means organizing a neighborhood barbecue together on a Saturday afternoon, standing shoulder to shoulder at the grill. It means fixing a sagging fence for an elderly neighbor down the street who's been meaning to get to it for months. It means planting flowers along the front walkways together, kneeling side by side in the dirt. It means driving Mrs. Patterson to the grocery store every Thursday because her own car finally gave out for good. It means reading picture books aloud to the neighborhood kids on lazy weekend afternoons under the old oak tree near the park. Slowly, almost without Nathan fully noticing it happening to him, something genuinely starts to shift inside him. He begins learning his neighbors' actual names for the first time in years, not just recognizing faces from a distance. He starts fixing bicycles for free in his driveway on weekend mornings, word spreading quickly among the neighborhood kids that he's the guy who can make anything ride smoothly again. He and Ava spend entire weekends together restoring the neglected park at the end of the block, replacing rusted swing chains, repainting faded benches, clearing overgrown weeds from the walking paths. Along the way, Nathan finds himself pulled into smaller stories happening all around him, stories he never had the patience or interest to notice before. There's an elderly widower 2 houses down, still grieving his wife years after her passing, who slowly starts joining them for coffee on quiet mornings. There's a shy young boy across the street who barely speaks above a whisper to anyone, gradually opening up as Nathan teaches him how to properly patch a bicycle tire. There's an older woman who keeps a small bundle of decades-old letters tucked in a drawer, letters from a husband long gone, that she eventually shows to Ava one afternoon over tea, trusting her with something deeply private. These small, scattered pieces of other people's lives begin teaching Nathan something he didn't realize he'd forgotten entirely since his mother died. Something buried under 2 years of quiet withdrawal from everyone around him. A real community isn't built out of perfectly maintained lawns or matching mailboxes, out of appearances kept up for the sake of passing strangers. It's built out of people who actually show up for each other again and again in small, unremarkable ways that add up to something much larger over time, something he's only now starting to understand from the inside. Ava notices the change in him too, even if she doesn't say much about it directly. She catches him laughing genuinely at something the shy boy across the street says one afternoon, catches him lingering a full extra hour at Mrs. Patterson's kitchen table listening to old stories about the neighborhood's early years. She doesn't comment on any of it out loud, but she starts including him more naturally in her plans, no longer having to convince him to join in on things the way she did those first few awkward weeks. One warm afternoon, while Nathan and Ava are working together in the community garden they've started building near the park, kneeling side by side in fresh soil, a small girl from down the street wanders over and watches them for a while, tilting her head curiously, sneakers scuffing at the dirt path. Eventually, She asks the question that neither of them is quite prepared to answer honestly. If you two ever broke up? She asks innocently, kicking at the dirt with her sneaker, entirely unaware of the weight her simple question carries. Who would keep watering the flowers? Both Nathan and Ava go quiet for a long moment, exchanging a brief, uncertain glance. Neither of them fully understands themselves in that instant. Neither one has an easy answer ready, and the little girl, sensing something shift in the silence, simply shrugs and wanders off toward her own yard, already forgetting she asked anything at all. Not long after that small, unsettling moment in the garden, Nathan happens to see something on Ava's laptop screen while helping her carry supplies inside one evening after a long day of festival planning. An email, still open on the desktop, confirming her acceptance into a major landscape design project based out in Chicago, an opportunity that would require relocating within the coming month, complete with attached details about salary and start dates. He doesn't say anything about it right away. He simply closes the laptop gently, setting it back down exactly where he found it, and walks back outside into the cooling evening air, the little girl's question suddenly settling much heavier in his chest than it had a few hours earlier, refusing to let go of him for the rest of that night. Nathan assumes almost immediately that Ava will take the Chicago offer without much hesitation. It's a significant career opportunity, exactly the kind of project she spent years building her portfolio toward, and he tells himself it would be selfish, even unfair, to expect anything different from her, to let his own feelings weigh into a decision that isn't really his to influence. He doesn't bring it up. He doesn't ask her about it directly, even when the perfect opening presents itself more than once over the following days. He simply carries the knowledge quietly, tucked away somewhere he doesn't examine too closely, while continuing to help her with everything on the street as if nothing has changed between them at all. Ava, for her part, keeps working exactly as hard as before, seemingly unaffected on the surface, though Nathan occasionally catches her staring off into the distance for a beat too long before returning to whatever task is in front of her. She continues finalizing her sketches for the redesigned park late into the evenings. She keeps organizing preparations for the neighborhood's upcoming fall festival, coordinating volunteers and food donations with the same quiet determination she's brought to everything since moving in months earlier. She spends long afternoons repairing flower beds along the main walkway, kneeling in the same dirt she's knelt in for weeks now, seemingly entirely focused on the work in front of her, hands steady even as something clearly weighs on her mind. One evening, working late in her small home office while dropping off supplies for the festival, Nathan happens to glance at the final landscape design plans spread across her drafting table, curious about what she's actually been building all these weeks behind closed doors. What he sees stops him completely in his tracks, his hand hovering above the paper without quite touching it. Printed carefully across the top of the finished blueprint isn't the project name he expected. It doesn't say Green Street, the working title everyone on the block has been using in casual conversation for weeks now. Instead, in careful, deliberate lettering, it simply reads, Home. Caught off guard, Ava finally admits something she's clearly been holding back for a while now, her voice quieter than usual, setting down the mug of tea she'd been holding. I was never really designing a park, she tells him, setting down her pencil, meeting his eyes directly for the first time in that conversation. I've been designing a place people actually want to come back to. That's what this was always about for me. From the very beginning, long before I understood it myself, long before I even had the words to explain it properly. Nathan doesn't know quite what to say to that. Standing there in the doorway of her small office, surrounded by sketches of walkways and flower beds that suddenly mean something far more personal than he realized. He simply nods, quietly absorbing the weight of what she's just told him, filing it away alongside the Chicago email he still hasn't mentioned to her at all. The emotional peak of everything arrives during the neighborhood's fall festival itself, held right in the newly restored park under strings of warm lights the whole street helped hang together the week before, volunteers climbing ladders and stringing bulbs between trees for 2 straight days. For the first time in over 2 years, the elderly widower from down the street finally steps outside his house for something other than absolute necessity, walking slowly but steadily toward the gathering with a cane in hand, his daughter hovering nearby just in case, though he waves her off gently, determined to make the walk himself. He makes his way to the old blue bench, lowering himself down carefully, looking out at the crowd of neighbors laughing, eating, and catching up around him, children weaving between the picnic tables with paper plates of food. "It's been a very long time," he says quietly to no one in particular, though Nathan happens to be standing close enough to hear every word clearly. "Since the street felt like a family again." Nathan feels something break open inside his chest at those words, tears rising before he can stop them. Standing there in the middle of the festival surrounded by string lights and laughter, and the smell of grilled food drifting through the evening air. He finally understands fully, completely, exactly what Ava has actually been building this entire time, and it was never really the park itself, was never really the flowers or the walkways or the restored swing set sitting freshly painted near the edge of the grass. It was the people. It was always the people, and the space simply gave them a reason to finally come back together after years of quietly drifting apart from each other. One missed dinner and one skipped porch conversation at a time. Later that same evening, once most of the crowd has thinned out and only a handful of neighbors remain scattered around dying string lights, Nathan finds Ava sitting alone on the blue bench, watching the last embers of the bonfire glow orange against the darkening sky. He sits down beside her without a word, and for a long while, neither of them says anything at all, both simply grateful in their own separate ways for everything the evening has managed to become. Nathan almost tells her about the Chicago email that night, the words rising to his throat more than once as they sit together in the quiet. But something holds him back each time, some instinct telling him it isn't his place to bring it up first, that whatever decision she makes needs to come from her alone, without his feelings weighing on the scale. Instead, he simply reaches over and takes her hand for a moment, saying nothing, letting the warmth of the dying fire and the sound of distant laughter fill the space where words might otherwise have gone. The crisis arrives faster than Nathan expects, faster than he's emotionally prepared for despite already knowing, deep down, that it was coming eventually ever since he saw that email weeks earlier. Chicago calls again, this time with a firm, final deadline. Ava needs to decide, definitively, by the following morning, whether she's accepting the position and relocating within the coming weeks, the recruiter making clear there's no more room for delay on their end. Nathan doesn't try to talk her out of it, doesn't plead with her to stay, doesn't say any of the things quietly sitting in his chest that he might, under different circumstances, have wanted to say out loud to her. Instead, that final evening, he simply shows up at her house and helps her pack, carrying boxes out to her car without complaint, wrapping fragile items carefully in old newspaper the way she taught him weeks earlier while working on the garden together, folding each sheet with more care than the task probably requires. Partway through loading the last box into her trunk, Ava finally stops and turns to face him directly under the porch light, studying his expression carefully, searching for something in his face he isn't quite offering. "You're not even going to try to get me to stay?" she asks, her voice carrying something between disbelief and quiet hurt, the question hanging heavy in the cool night air between them. Nathan sets down the box he's holding and meets her eyes steadily, choosing his words with obvious care, taking a moment before answering at all. "I don't want you staying here because you feel guilty about leaving," he tells her honestly. "If you stay, I want it to be because you actually want to, not because of anything I said to convince you otherwise. You deserve better than a decision made out of guilt." Ava doesn't respond right away, simply studying him for a long, quiet moment under the porch light before turning back to the car without another word. the silence between them saying more than either of them seems able to put into speech that night. The contest results arrived that same week, almost as if timed cruelly to coincide with everything else happening on the street. Against every expectation anyone on the block had going into the competition, their street wins the Most Welcoming Street award outright, securing the full grant needed to save the community center for good. The announcement coming through a phone call that has half the neighbors gathered on someone's front lawn within the hour. The neighbors gather to celebrate together that evening, cheering, hugging, popping open bottles of cheap sparkling cider on someone's front lawn, kids running circles around the adults in pure excitement. But even with that victory, even with the community center saved exactly the way everyone hoped it would be, Ava still climbs into her car the following morning as planned, suitcase in the back seat, the small moving truck already sent ahead days earlier. Nathan stands in his driveway watching her pull away down the street, past the community garden they built together, past the park benches they repainted side by side, past the blue bench where this entire strange, unexpected story first began weeks earlier with a stranger's careless question. He doesn't chase after the car. He simply watches until it turns the corner and disappears completely from view, the street suddenly feeling far quieter than it has in weeks, the morning air unusually still around him. 3 months pass. The newly finished park stands fully complete now, its flower beds blooming steadily through the changing seasons, its swing set repainted and swarmed daily by neighborhood kids after school lets out. The community center has officially reopened its doors as well, already hosting weekly potlucks, children's story hours, and the kind of casual gatherings the street hasn't seen consistently in years. The old blue bench is still exactly where it's always been, sitting quietly between the two houses where this all started. Nathan still sits there most evenings after work, the way he did for 3 long years before Ava ever moved in next door. Though the bench rarely stays empty for long anymore these days, usually filled by one neighbor or another stopping by to chat. Then, one ordinary afternoon, a car pulls slowly up to the curb outside. Ava steps out, carrying noticeably little with her this time. No moving boxes, no overflowing bags, nothing that suggests a full relocation back. Just a single small potted plant cradled carefully in both hands. Nathan looks up, a slow smile spreading across his face as he takes in the sight of her standing there again. "Back for the neighborhood?" he asks, half joking, though something hopeful clearly sits underneath the question. Ava shakes her head slowly, walking over and settling herself down onto the blue bench beside him without hesitation, setting the small plant carefully between them. "No," she says softly, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm back because I don't want us to keep pretending anymore." Together, without needing to say much else about it, they plant the small potted flower right beside the old bench, kneeling in the dirt one more time, exactly like they've done so many times before over the past few months. A group of neighborhood kids comes running past just then, laughing loudly, chasing each other down the sidewalk in the late afternoon light. One of them stops abruptly, catching sight of Nathan and Ava together, and calls out a question with the blunt honesty only children ever seem to manage. "Are you two really together now?" Nathan glances over at Ava, and this time, for the first time since any of this began weeks earlier with a stranger's simple question, he doesn't answer for her. He lets the moment sit there, waiting. Ava reaches over and takes his hand firmly in hers, smiling warmly at the child. "Yes," she says simply, without a trace of hesitation this time. That evening, as the sun sinks low behind the rooftops, the old blue bench is no longer the lonely spot where one man sat by himself night after night. It has become, slowly and quietly, the true center of the entire street, where neighbors bring over dishes to share, children curl up with picture books, elderly residents gather for slow games of checkers, and Nathan and Ava sit together at the middle of it all, surrounded by the easy sound of laughter carrying across the whole block. Sometimes what actually turns a place into a real home isn't a beautiful house or a freshly paved road. It's the people who choose, again and again, to show up for each other, to truly listen, and to build memories worth holding on to together. A relationship works exactly the same way. It doesn't become real simply because of what someone happens to say to a passing stranger. It becomes real because two people decide, quietly, every single day afterward, to treat each other with genuine, unguarded honesty.